Hi, and thank you so much for popping by. My name is Dr. Ziyaphapha, and you're most welcome to this conversation today. For a bit of background context, I am a Motswana, born and bred in Botswana. I did my primary school in Orapa at Livingston House, and in 1992, I went to Zimbabwe, specifically to JZ Moyo High School, to do my O levels. This high school is a government school located on Majoda Farms, a few kilometers away from a small town called West Nicholson. Something interesting about this school is that Jason Ziyaphapha Moyo, the man whom the school was named after, was the founder of the Zimbabwe People's Liberation Army, or ZIPRA. He was also a member of the African National Congress, or the ANC branch in Bulawayo. My young brother was also in Zimbabwe at a different boarding school called Shungu High, a boys' school in Kwekwe. During the school holidays, my father would drive from Orapa to pick us up. Sometimes my dad would pick me up first from Majoda Farms, and then we would drive past Gweru to Kwekwe to pick up my brother and back to Botswana. At times, I didn't go home for the school break, and I would stay with my host family in Bulawayo, or Blues. My host family was a husband and wife, and they had 3 children who were our ages at the time, or teenagers. I remember the family as a warm, hospitable, humble, church-going, and very prayerful family. The husband, who has since passed away, was a headmaster at a school in Gwanda, and his wife was a stay-at-home mother. My young brother also had a host family in Gweru, where he would stay during some of the shorter school holidays. It is no secret why my parents decided to send us to Zimbabwe for high school, and I knew many other Botswana who studied in Zimbabwe in both government and private schools. To this day, and despite the low economic status of the country, Zimbabwe's education system is of a high standard. In Zimbabwe, you do 4 years of O levels and then the option of doing an additional 2 years of advanced levels before going to college or university. In 2024, Zimbabwe was ranked number 4 on the top 10 African countries with the highest education levels. And although I speak to the good quality of education, I am not speaking to the quality of resources allocated for learning. I knew then that the teachers in Zimbabwe were not earning enough to lead a good quality life. During my high school days, I got to appreciate the importance of agriculture to the economy. As I mentioned, JZ Moyo High School is based on Majoda Farms. On this farm, we got the opportunity to learn about animal husbandry and agricultural production. We had pigs on the school. We were growing vegetables such as maize and fruits of different kinds. And at that time, Zimbabwe was known for being the breadbasket of the region. The country was feeding itself and also feeding other countries. To this day, we have uniquely Zimbabwean food products on Botswana supermarket shelves, such as Mazoe, Quality, and Kefalus yogurt, to name a few. And I recently saw a news report about how Zimbabwe is exporting blueberries globally, speaking to this strong agricultural production ethos in the country. I lived in Zimbabwe when it was at its best, and I've also seen Zimbabwe at its most compromised state. The last time I was in Harare was around 2019 and 2020 on a professional or work-related trip. And it was clear then that the quality of life in the country had depreciated. The obvious things, such as people walking long distances with their vegetable carts, the standard of the buildings and infrastructure, the constant power cuts, the sound of the generators at the hotels. And I am not saying there is no inequality in Botswana. However, the levels of poverty, inequality, and the lack are much higher in Zimbabwe. The margins between those who have and those who have absolutely nothing are wider in Zimbabwe and highly obvious to the naked eye. Which is why both countries, Botswana and Zimbabwe, are listed as having high concentrations of HIV. Countries in Southern Africa, which is the global region with the highest prevalence rates of HIV. Additionally, data shows that a high number of sex workers in Botswana are actually from Zimbabwe, trading in places such as the towns and the cities, as well as the Kazungula Bridge area, where truck drivers are passing through from various locations in Africa. Something I wanted to point out is that during my time at Moyo High School, I met a lot of South African students. And some of the South African students had a very distinct characteristic. For one, they were typically more mature or older than the general students. For example, some of them had children and they spoke about having families as in they were married. As such, they stood out in comparison to your typical high school student. And some of the South African students I met in Zimbabwe were quite private about who they are and their peculiar backgrounds. Over time, I got to hear stories about the strong links and associations the South African students had to various political parties in South Africa. Essentially, some of the students were freedom fighters and they definitely had the scars to prove it. It was through the stories they told and the freedom songs they used to sing that I got to learn about the PAC, the Pan-African Congress of Azania, and Apla, the Azanian People's Liberation Army. I-Apla iyasha, I-Apla iyadubula e-Azania. There was another song they used to sing about Amabunu. At the time, I was coming from a very sheltered Botswana. I could not connect with the gravity nor the seriousness behind the words in the songs. I simply enjoyed the melodies. With time, I realized that Zimbabwe was indeed harboring a lot of South African freedom fighters in their system. They were sheltering a lot of South Africans from apartheid. Predominantly, I met Black South Africans, as was the case in Botswana and other African international countries that were helping to shelter South Africans from apartheid. And why am I talking about the Zimbabwe I know now? Recent news reports indicate that President Mnangagwa, through the ZANU-PF party, aims to follow in the footsteps of former President Robert Mugabe and his administration by overstaying his welcome in the presidency, to the extent of aspiring to change the constitution to enable the president and his party to stay longer in power. Through news reports, the argument I heard from the ZANU-PF spokesperson is that the party believes it can achieve more if they stay longer in power, that they can complete the plans they have in motion. And at this point, I am wondering if Zimbabweans would want to go through the same experience they endured during the end of the Mugabe era, where if they were to push back against the constitutional reform, they might end up being beaten, jailed, or worse. This including the journalists, some of whom, like Blessing Mhlanga, have already been jailed for reporting what is happening in the country. And of course, media freedom in Zimbabwe has consistently been ranked low. The problem with social strife when it happens in Zimbabwe is that it negatively affects the strained relationship between ordinary Botswana and ordinary Zimbabweans. To this day, there is tension between the two populations because of the influx of Zimbabweans who moved to Botswana. As I have said, the Zimbabwean I know, my friends, close friends, sisters and brothers are hardworking, humble, hospitable, creative, enterprising, resourceful, and intelligent. At the same time, and due to the economic and political instability in the country, over the years, I have grown to know a Zimbabwean I do not appreciate. The Zimbabwean who will steal, kill, rape, and does all the other forms of social ills in Botswana in order to survive. And one thing I have noticed is that Zimbabweans and Botswana have similar temperaments in the sense that they are patriotic. And in our context, it means that we should not say anything negative about our countries. Zimbabweans and Botswana have similar temperaments as they are less likely to be confrontational or to vocalize openly their inner thoughts and opinions about leadership, and as compared to our neighbors in South Africa, who are more empowered to push back against oppression, and oppressive leadership. Additionally, Botswana's xenophobia is more subtle and not as obvious or vocalized as that of South Africa. And what data is now showing is that Zimbabweans over time are also developing reverse xenophobia, negative attitudes towards the populations in their host countries, such as Botswana and South Africa. I also thought to mention the former president of Botswana, Lieutenant General Ian Khama, who has since adopted and reverted to his Kgosi-Kgolo Yabangwatu status and is now using his royal title Kgosi Khama IV. This is for sure a man with many lives and many faces. Khama IV was one of the few leaders within Southern Africa who had the guts to say anything about former President Mugabe's leadership style and how towards the end it had heavily compromised Zimbabwean lives. And I perceive that the cadre of presidents from the freedom fighter generation were looking at Khama IV as someone who is disconnected from the history of colonization and apartheid. And thus I wonder which president or presidents within our region will break the mold and caution Zimbabwe's current president should he decide to pull the same political and disruptive stunts as his late predecessor. Or will the ordinary citizens of Southern Africa continue to bear the brunt of the political and economic instability in Zimbabwe? And as the leaders maintain their intra-African diplomacy and Pan-Africanism ethos. Alrighty, my friend, I thank you so much for popping by. I hope you are having a lovely day where you are, but most importantly, I hope you are having a healthy day wherever you're watching me from. Bye.